I'm picking as my subject today the agency house, the former agency house in Oacoma. And I call it a house of memory for reasons that you'll see. And I'm starting off with Mount Rushmore. Well, why not? Going to talk about Oacoma, start off with Mount Rushmore, but you will see why in a few minutes. So first of all, if I can draw your attention to this, this picture. Here you have all the fine people who helped. It's actually the committee, the Mount Rushmore committee, in front of the mountain before they started the project. And you can see 3 years after it was approved. And you don't need those people's names below to identify the sculptor. You'll notice how he's got that little hat, and notice the pose, right? Sort of, oh, right. And so everyone else is sort of standing sternly and staring, but just to what would be his left, there's this tallish man, and I'm going to be talking about him later. And that person is kind of interestingly involved in the community of Oacoma. So what we all know about Mount Rushmore is the big idea. And this is one of the few pictures we have that shows the rock before it was carved up. And it's an amazing thing, isn't it? Look at it, it's gnarled. You don't need to put faces in it to see faces. You know, this is very clear. And, you know, I'm not going to talk about, you know, I can, but I'm not going to with this one. Another time, we can talk about all the background of Mount Rushmore because it's so interesting. For instance, did you know, and I'm sure many of you do, that the original idea was to carve the needles? You know, this mountain was not the original intent. It was the needles, and it was going to be all of the figures of the Wild West. You know, there was going to be so every needle was going to be somebody else. So that was the original idea. It went through a lot of iterations. And, you know, of course, there was a lot of politics involved, but when you get to Mount Rushmore, just about every breath you take is a political one. It's sort of unavoidable. Clearly, because of where I work, I understand a perception that's a little bit different. And to, I'd say, any of the indigenous peoples who lived there, the Kiowa, who you know, before 1804, the Lakota came after, clearly saw enormous spiritual power in these rocks. You can't help it. And if you think about it, why is Mount Rushmore there? The same reason that people before Mount Rushmore revered it. There's something about that. It's got its own power within it. But then after 1926, they decided they wanted to carve faces in it. And so they did. And it's interesting because this is probably something you don't know, but the Lower Brule elders got together with their relatives from Rosebud, because you know originally they're the same band, the Sishangu, and that's the burnt thigh. That's what burnt thigh is, and we call them the Lower Brules or Brule. Brule is just like creme brulee. It means burnt in French, and so the French traders said, "Oh, you're the Brule, people of the burnt thigh." Well, they split up, you know, way back when, but they're still close as relatives. And so the elders of Rosebud and the elders of Lower Brule got together, and we've created a highway map of western South Dakota of the Great Sioux Reservation. And all of the names are in Lakota. So we have made a highway map and published a highway map with all the names in Lakota. And a lot of places there were traditional names. And some places, they coined new names in Lakota. Well, the name for Mount Rushmore, and if there's anyone here who speaks Lakota, I apologize, because I will not. Look, I had to take French from grade 3, because I'm a Canadian. I had to take French from grade 3. Okay, I'm sorry, I can't do that either. French, so my Lakota is going to be Iyan Ihahapi, and it means the rock made fun of. So that's a Lakota word, the rock, they made fun of it by putting those faces on it. So there you see this great gulf, don't you, between, you know, the great patriotic ideal and you know, the urge of a young state for an economy. You know, all of these things, all these big things are at work. And, you know, the elders get together and they say, they made fun of our rock, our sacred rock, you know, they made fun of it. It's a different kind of way of thinking. So I got to add another thing. There's another thing, the reason I'm going to talk about Mount Rushmore, and that's because I was fortunate enough to do the archaeological survey of Mount Rushmore for the National Park Service long ago, a couple of decades or so. When was it? Oh, well, actually, maybe it was 2006. So I was hired literally to walk every inch of Mount Rushmore. And I've stood on George's head, as a matter of fact. So, and I've seen everything there. And what I found was that there's a hidden Mount Rushmore. Because everyone who goes there goes to see the, you know, the face. I mean, it's an astounding sight. It's unforgettable. But there's a hidden Mount Rushmore. And the hidden Mount Rushmore is the Mount Rushmore of ordinary people. First of all of the indigenous people who lived around there. And I mean, it wasn't crowded. I mean, the place is hot and dry. But there's game up there. And next to it, there's a little seepage, a starling basin. You know, there's places to go. And then what I found really interesting in the park was, after they built it, was the park infrastructure itself. You know, just the people who work there, people who live there, not just the ones who carved the rock either, but the park employees. And there's a lot of this. See, at one time, Mount Rushmore, you had the faces, but it was a pleasant little park. It had trees. It had little pathways. It had picnic sites, you know, just this pleasant little place. And there was a spring, and you could get water from the spring. We found a hand-dug well in the middle of the creek. The creek's now a runoff for the residents, so you can't even drink the water because it's coming out of treatment. And there's a hand nicely lined with rocks, so you could dip a pail in it and you get your spring water. There's one thing left, and I'll tell you, if you do go to Mount Rushmore and you take that, I think they call it the Presidential Trail that winds along the scree, keep an eye out for some irises, because there's a little niche, and right there in the corner, probably there's a ponderosa pine or some tree growing there now, there are some irises. Well, that was the ranger cabin that was put there, I think in the 20s, and is long gone, except for the irises. They're still there. And to me, that's as important an archaeological find as I made at Mount Rushmore. And I can talk another time about Mount Rushmore, which is fascinating in its own way. But the point I wanted to make was this thing between the big idea and these little details, which are the details of just ordinary people like us, just trying to live, right? Just carrying on with their jobs or visitors who come. Do you know that in the forest, there are little walkways made out of crushed white quartz? Of course, you're not allowed to go there now. But they were the old trails. They used to line them. And in one place, it's really startling. It's almost surreal. There's a guardrail, a beautiful guardrail on a curve in the middle of a forest. It's from the old road. It was a big guardrail. It's long, been abandoned, and the trees have grown up, and it's the strangest thing to see this guardrail in the trees. You know. So there's lots of that kind of thing. So anyway, I think the challenge in history is, you know, if you read the books, it's all about, oh, you know, these people did this and those people did that and this and that and the other. And I'm as guilty as any about having big ideas. But sometimes they can overwhelm the real history. And the real history is local. And you know, it's funny when you read, people get arrogant, don't they? They'll go, oh yeah, well, you know, we have a local history society, but hey, you know, the big guns are at the university. Well, come on. All history is local, in my view. All history is local, and that's because all history is created by individual people. It doesn't, you name it. You name it. Whatever big idea it is, came out of somebody's head. Every action is the action of an individual person, even if they've been, you know, put up to it. So history, in a sense, is what's in our hands, how we act, what we do. That's really history. And so the big stories emerge out of little stories. And I got a couple of words. I don't know, many of you might have heard of the complete Oxford Dictionary of the English language. It comes in, I don't know, 30 volumes or something. When I saw it, in reality, I could not believe there could be that many. Well, I have a CD of it, and I spend a lot of time with it. And I got a couple of words for you, because I was trying to think, we don't have any good words for kind of local history. And so I'm going to throw a word at you that you'll recognize, tidings. And it survives in one place, right? It survives in a Christmas carol. I think it's "We wish you Merry Christmas, good tidings we bring." That's it. But tidings goes way back to the 11th century. And in fact, here in South Dakota, it's a Norse word. It comes from the Norse. The origin is, so if any of you are from Norse heritage, it's a good old Norwegian word. And it means, as you might expect, something that happens, an event, an incident. You know, so in other words, you bring tidings of something, you bring news. And the most important thing is that this is in the 10th century or 11th century, this is before the invention of the printing press. So when you brought news, you brought it, you spoke it out. Okay, another one is gossip. Now, we all know about gossip, but here's the thing. Do you know the origin of gossip? Same time, 11th century. A gossip was a godparent. A gossip was the person who supported and announced the birth of a child. So the godmother and godfather, they didn't always have to be named godmother and godfather, because that depended on the, you know, on a religious tradition. But the gossip was the person that spread the news, the good news about the birth of the child. And like a lot of words over the centuries, they've changed from really good words to what we laugh about now as gossips, spreading every old thing. And nobody wants to be known as a gossip. But back then, you were proud to be a gossip. It was a very positive experience. So both of these, archaic, obsolete, almost gone out of the language, describe what people do, and that's share things amongst themselves, talk and carry on about the news. So in going and looking at this house in Oacoma, I'm going to do a little bit of local news, right? That's what we're going to talk about. And I was going to bring the newspaper article with me, and of course I left it, didn't I? But you can now flip to the agent's house. And I don't know why on the page in the National Register, the only photograph of the house at Oacoma is the back. Now, who takes only the back picture of a house? I can't go there, I don't know. But anyway, tragically, a number of years ago, it was burnt down. And it's a deep tragedy. especially for people like us who value history, you know. It's terrible. And but the newspaper report's really important. I mean, it was an astounding report at one level, extremely simple, very simple. It just said it like it was. But there were a couple of things in it that apparently it had been derelict for years. And, you know, I feel sorry that the owners of the house, it must have been a terrible burden because, you know, they didn't live in it. It was on their property. What were they going to do with it? You know, it just seemed like it didn't have a home. It was a house without being a home. And again, it was they say the superintendent's house at the agency at Lower Brule, which was there from about 1879, 1880 to 1895. That was the life of that house there. And then it was moved up to present-day Oacoma. So here's this house dating back to, with an extraordinary history. And go to the next slide. Here's the plaque on it. Look at that. What does it say there? Something, Lower Brule Agency House. It's been placed on the National Record. I've got one of those on my house. I got a little cottage in Vermilion with that plaque on it. But it's not a big deal like this house, I assure you. And so here you've got this beautiful monument. And yet, there's something odd about the whole thing, this newspaper article, the fact that it was derelict. So I started to look into it. And here's the thing about the National Register, and you know, I've dealt with this a lot of my career, and that is that, you know, the National Register confers prestige, and it also confers hope. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Because it gives it immense historical value. It says this is important to the nation, right? And yet the reality here was that it was derelict. It sagged under the weight of 150 years, and it had been moved from its original location. It received no visitors and had no support from anyone. Just sat there with this lovely plaque on it. And there's this tremendous irony and a mystery. So here we go. I'm watching by the way, I am looking at my watch. Why is it that the places that history actually takes place are often overwhelmed by the institutions and places designed to generalize about it and then present its artifacts, right? So here we have a case, we have a house that saw great events of history. Now, 3 miles down the road in Chamberlain, what do we have? We have the Hall of Fame, the South Dakota Hall of Fame, right? And it's a worthy thing. It's got hundreds of people, and I was looking through the list at, you know, some of the interesting people. And from Lower Brule, one of them was Alfred Ziegler, who was a wonderful man. I was lucky to meet him when he was very old. But he was a nationally known painter and artist. He flew his own airplane. That's me making those noises, I know. I shouldn't have it. But imagine, Alfred Ziegler had an airplane. He flew around Lower Brule. I'm just trying to get all I can about this wonderful story about Alfred and his airplane. But that's a side thing. So here you have all these people with plaques in the Hall of Fame. And yet, 3 miles away was where this next person lived, and that's Iron Nation. Mm-hmm. And that's an earlier picture of Iron Nation because it doesn't have the medals that they used to pass out to appropriate people. And so, you know, Iron Nation had a band of extended families, and there were quite a number of bands, but he was pretty well recognized as the leader. And if you read any of his speeches, he was a wise man. There's no doubt about it that Iron Nation was a wise man. So here you have this house. It's tied to some of the great formative events in South Dakota history. And it was recognized on the National Register. But as I say, it's built on hope. The hope is that the idea of historical significance will be enough to preserve and protect it. You know, and everyone here knows how hard that is. Like, I don't think there's a single person here that doesn't feel frustration when these things happen, because we know the value of history. And if you're like me, I remember grade 12. I think the world is grade 12. You think of your class. How many kids in your class were interested in history? I mean, really, not many. When I was 12, I wanted to work in a museum. And you know what? I was so naive. I had no idea the other kids, you know, I didn't know the other kids who would have thought I was completely loony, you know. Anyway, what I want to do, because the house burnt down, I want to, and there's a lot more than this, but I'm just covering a few of these little things. I want to quickly go through how the house happened and give you kind of a little bit of context before I get to some little bit interesting information. And you can put on that first map. So imagine that the Lower Brule people, they're called the Kuichasha Oyate. And that essentially means those are the people who lived in the low areas, the lowlands, what we know of as the bottom of the river valley and the river valley. But it's funny, you know, you think Upper Brule and Lower Brule, because the Hayata Wichasha are the Rosebud people, and that means in the uplands. But you get confused because Rosebud is south, isn't it? It's downstream. But it's not all about the Missouri, it's about the White River. Okay, the Hayata Wichasha live in the White River Basin, in the uplands towards the Black Hills. The Lower Brule, the Kuichasha, live down by the river, by the mouth of the White. Now, the first agency, and you can see, not very well there, but notice at the top you can see a church, then you can see a Brule Indian village, and then down below you can see the old site of the Brule Agency. Now this map, some of you may recognize these as the Missouri River Commission maps, but this is a special set. And I've known about those for years, but I just stumbled upon them recently. And amazingly, they're on the web, and I highly recommend you look at them. This set is in the Omaha Public Library. What's important about them is they date to 1878, 1879. 10 years, more than 10 years before the maps that we're more familiar with came out. And what's neat about them, if you're steamboat enthusiasts, they have the wood yards marked. All the wood yards that supplied the steamboats at the time are on this map, this whole series of maps, which go all the way to Pierre. So it's really quite interesting. And notice here, Brule City. Now, down at the res, we used to have a place just off res called Malfunction Junction. And I regret I never took a picture of it. I didn't think it was ever going to not exist. But one day it was all over, and I missed the chance. But I still remember this wonderful sign, Malfunction Junction. And of course, it had a sliding door you could drive up and buy liquor at there. And, you know, Brule City did that back in the 1870s, 1880s. And it was liquor, guns, and ammo, basically. But there was another thing about Brule City that's quite interesting. And I know I'm jumping around, and I'm trying not to get lost, but I got to tell you what's really interesting about Brule City in this regard. When Greasy Grass happened, that's what we call the Little Bighorn. And then in 1877, when they took back the Black Hills, it was all over then. Now, the people who didn't know it was all over were the tribes. But the first sign of it being all over was the railroad agreements in 1880, because as you recall, in that Pettigrew bill, they said you have to have 3 railroads going through your Great Sioux Reservation. Oh, we're not going to touch it otherwise. We just let those railroads go through. Well, there was a lot of scuttlebutt in those days about where those railroads would go. And at first, it was said that Brule City, that it was going to go up the White River. So if the railroad was going to go up the White River, you got all these entrepreneurs who were coming down to establish something there at what they call Brule City. They called it that because the reservation, the bands of the reservation lived across the river. And that's Bull Creek, by the way, that little one coming out south of the White. And that's really the kind of core homeland of the Kuichasha, the Lower Brule people. And so you can imagine, I always like to imagine being one of those people. So you can imagine any of us saying, yeah, look at, you guys will make a killing down there. The railroad's going to come through. We can have a town, and all this good stuff. So all this happens. There was another one. The Dakota Northern Railway was going to, they got actually permission to build a railway up Medicine Creek, if any of you know Medicine Creek. So there were all these ideas. Okay, so well, unfortunately, Brule City somehow didn't. Another thing that happened, it caused such an uproar in the 1870s that President Grant actually extended the reservation, the Lower Brule Reservation. You know that in 1865, Lower Brule had a separate reservation. They did a treaty before the Treaty of 1868 of Fort Laramie that created that giant reservation. Lower Brule had its own reservation in 1865. And it was basically 10 by 20 miles, 10 miles in, 20 miles along the shore, from roughly above the mouth of the White River, south, okay? And so we had this railroad agreement in 1880. They did get compensated. They sold land for a depot at what is now Oacoma. And then in 1882, they tried to push a bill through to split up the Great Sioux Reservation in 1882. It failed. They didn't get the votes right. And that was the first attempt. But here's the thing that happened that was really bad. And I wanted for this one to grab this pronouncement from the president, but I missed it. But it's in the New York Times in 1883, new land for settlers. They're opening up the Great Sioux Reservation. That was in 1883. So you can imagine being an immigrant. You've come over from the old world. You're stuck in the east somewhere, and here's this new land. So people started to go west. Even though that land was legally the Great Sioux Reservation, and I've got lots of correspondence that shows the efforts of the government to try to control people, but they had no better chance of controlling the people than they did in the Black Hills. Just, people would squat. And another thing that you never read, at least I haven't, tree cutting was one of the worst problems, because all the land was the Great Sioux Reservation. They were cutting trees. So white people came in, settlers, and they would literally just go and cut all the trees. And when you cut the trees, you've destroyed the habitat. And it became a big problem. They tried to control. And when they started to build the telegraph lines, I've got a contract with a telegraph company where there was an agreement to supply 3,100 cedar posts for a telegraph line. Then they're all going to be cut in the Big Bend. Now, 3,500 trees seems like a heck of a lot to me. But all of these things were happening. So in the 1870s and 80s, people were piling up on the east side of the Missouri River. And, the end was sort of nigh. But while existed, the agency thrived. And I'll show you another, and we'll go through quickly. So here you've got, there's Chamberlain. See, by this time, Chamberlain had just started. Again, more speculation, right? Oh, I think maybe the rail line's going to cross here. And here's the Brule Agency. There's American Crow Creek. And you know, that's where that golf range is. Any of you ever go down to the golf course at Oacoma? They have a driving range that's right along here by American Crow Creek. Anyway, that agency became kind of the center of Lower Brule life, in the 1880s. And we have a picture of the agency. And if you look down the row, look at the house with the little porch. What, third, fourth from the end? Okay, that's the agency house. That's the house we're talking about. That's the one that burnt down. So that was in the 1880s. Okay, so next slide. And this is a view of the agency that was painted by William Fuller. It's a wonderful thing because it shows you all sorts of things, teepees, various buildings in the distance, and it's a pretty good representation. He's got the skyline quite well, and you could imagine he's done that from those hills above Oacoma. If you go on I-90, just before you get to Al's Oasis, you've got all those knolls around there. So he was up there somewhere painting. And so that's what the agency looked like. And it was a pretty good place because there was decent land there right by the river. White River mouth was not very far away, just a mile or two, so it was really kind of nice. However, when it came, it was already, they were already gone. They didn't know it, the tribes. And soon enough, we started with the Act of 1889, and that's when they split the Great Sioux Reservation into its current smaller pieces. Now, there was a lot of resistance. The tribes were not happy, as you can imagine. And I know they always say, we should, there's lots of different cliches about, being in someone else's shoes, but really do think of the trauma of leaving all you've known, whoever you are. And so they didn't want to leave. They had it's quite simple. I mean, I am so, I'm a Canadian. I've got no ancestry of anything else but Northern European, But I can recognize, they didn't invite us here. They didn't ask us to come, It's always good to remember that. You don't have to go any further than that. Just remember that. They didn't invite us here. They were perfectly happy the way they were, And I don't go beyond that. I mean, I don't make a big thing of it, but, So they were there, and the Act of 1889 was going to happen. They just didn't know when. And what the chiefs did is they negotiated with the Sioux Commission, which was a bunch of hard-nosed negotiators that they brought up, including generals, military generals, General Crook, and all these people to, make this happen. And the chief said, we're not going to do anything until we meet with the president. And you have to imagine this, the perspective. Put yourself in the place of people who found pretty much everything to do with us alien, but especially things like concepts of property. They just had no idea. But the other thing they didn't know, which is really interesting, is the chain of authority. When I told the meeting of elders at Lower Brule that I was going to go to England, and they wondered if I might see the Queen. See? And, you can find people anywhere who are like that. I suppose from an urban perspective, we'd say they're so provincial that they think you can just do that kind of thing. Oh yeah, you can go to the White House and, hey, hi there. Of course you can't. We know that. So the chief said, we are not going to sign anything unless you let us go to Washington. So we do this next picture. And there they are. There's all the chiefs. And up here, this is very fuzzy, unfortunately, but this little row here right in the back of the Lower Brule, that's, those are some of the leaders right up there. And the idea was the chiefs wanted to meet with the president and get the president to do something. And they just couldn't take in, I can see why, couldn't take in our complex jurisdictional system, legal system, political system. It wasn't all about the president. The president couldn't. A council of chiefs could come up with a decision, right? The president couldn't. They didn't know that stuff. So they went to Washington, and they must have been cowed by, and that was part of the strategy. It was good strategy on the part of the government to bring these chiefs to Washington. Imagine anybody been to Washington lately? It's just the same. I mean, you go there and you go, oh my gosh, I'm glad to be back in South Dakota, Although I did find a dessert place, they make French pastries, I guess. So, yeah. Anyway, so they went to the Capitol. And one thing, this is an aside, but to show you the feelings of people, I always like to look at, pictures, body language in pictures. Do you see that guy on the left? 1, 2, in the third row? Do you notice everyone's standing like this, right? Except for that guy? You see that? Do you know who that is?
Sitting Bull.
Yes. Sitting Bull. He's telling the photographer, I'm not too happy about this. Look he's slouched away from it. He's got his weight on his leg. His hat is like this. He is showing how much he disagrees with what's going on. But like everyone else, he was caught, and you get this sense of being caught up in something that you can't control. Okay, so there was also a lot of resistance elsewhere. Now, any of you been to Lower Brule or through it? A couple of people? It's all, a lot of gumbo hills, right? And how in good conscience can you read the fine words of the government that say, we want you to become farmers, and then move them to the worst land for farming? And, they were hunters and gatherers. They knew more about the land than the South Dakota people did, to be honest. And of course, it's beautiful up there. I work in the tribal building. We're perched on the top of the valley on the bluffs. It's a spectacular view. I see buffalo herds and, it's fabulous up there. But it's terrible if you're trying to, make any kind of a living. And even Red Cloud, if you've heard of Red Cloud's agency, after 1876, they wanted to move the Oglalas to the Missouri. They wanted all those Sioux Indians on the Missouri, and they tried to move Red Cloud to Medicine Creek. Well, some advanced people for for Red Cloud, advanced people went and they said, oh no. And Red Cloud just plainly said, no, we're not going there. And they built an agency. They actually built an agency at Medicine Creek. And it lasted, I think, they built it, a few people came, they had troops there for a year or two, and that was the end of it. Even they didn't want to live up there. And no Lower Brule wanted to live up there where they live now. Nobody did. The White River, if you go down there, it's beautiful down there. It's a beautiful rolling lands, and it's a lovely little valley. But in any case, they signed the treaty. And, one more during this. During the negotiations, Iron Nation said, we want to live on the White River. And he talked to General Crook. He said, General, can you help us? Can you tell the president, we just want to live on the White River? And, the thing is that everybody else knew it was impossible because the Congress had decided that boundaries, and that was that. That was the way it was going to be. Nobody was going to change it. But I liked what Useful Heart said. during these negotiations. He said, "Now, my friends, we live right here and know the creeks and where there's good water and good land. And on that place we have mentioned, White River, there's plenty of water and good timber and plenty of land to cultivate." They didn't really want to cultivate, but they had to play the game, right? "And the Lower Brules want to take up their reservation on that land we spoke about and on the south side of this railroad that they knew was coming out, and have their reservation there. We know it is the best land." And so they really tried. And of course, it wasn't going to work. But I think they knew it, see. And there's a little bit of proof. If you read the commission's account, so you go to the next slide, and I'll talk about this in a minute. When you read the commission's account, there's a very interesting event. And it's one piece of history that's been a little bit misrepresented, because when you read about the agency house, it said they signed treaties there. Well, actually, I'll tell you what happened. During the negotiations, Iron Nation said to General Crook, he said, "We would not like to go up to the house to sign the paper, but we will sign it here on the field." Crook he said, "Can you guys get this over with? Because it's July the 4th is coming up." You know, I mean, imagine. So here these people are giving up their whole existence, and they're worried about July the 4th. But so Iron Nation said that. He said, "If you're in such a hurry to go to Chamberlain, you can go up there and come back, and you know, and then we'll sign it when you come back." And so General Crook said, "Okay, we'll sign the bill here." Okay, later, after there was a lot of different speeches, and after they came back in the afternoon, General Crook said, "The chiefs wanted us to bring the table here." So bring the table out of the agency outside, and they brought it. They first said they wanted to talk among themselves, and afterwards they decided they would sign it right here. "They've been asking us lots of questions, so I have stayed here and answered them." At that point, Iron Nation stepped forward, signed the bill, was followed by all the other chiefs and Indians, and the council was adjourned. So just that fact, it really struck me. They wanted it signed it outside. See, they didn't want to go into that building. They had dignity. They had dignity left. You know, their last bit of dignity in a process they knew they weren't going to win was to not to sign it in the building. And you know, after that, it took years. The other thing is people may not be aware is that the tribe, they kept trying to get them to go up on that res, up into the Gumbo Hills, but they didn't want to go. And it was really messy for about 10 years between about 1885 and 1895. Actually, up until 1899, because the Rosebud people didn't want the Lower Brules to come down and take land on their reservation. So it's a big mess, and I'd rather just to skip that part. But one of the other things they wanted to do was get the tribes to give up the reservation idea and just get land, get fee title to land. But I'll tell you about one chap. It's interesting. His name was Willie Nee, and he got his allotment in 1892. And in 1895, he went to the Land Commission and pleaded, "Could I give back my allotment, and could I just go up and with my fellows and live in the reservation?" And the agency's quite far away, so it's hard for me to get my rations. And he said, "And there's no jobs. I'm too far away, there's no jobs." And he said, "And if I go away, people interfere with my cattle." And that's why he wanted, and that's why none of the idea of the allotments were any good, any more than it would be for us to be isolated, kind of a stranger in a land that has become strange, you know. It's just one of those things. And so anyway, Iron Nation resisted. He really wouldn't leave his house. And an interesting another item I picked up. By the way, whenever you're doing research, forget the big books. you have to get into the letters, the correspondence, because that's where it really happens. Like I said at the beginning, people writing, people speaking, that's what you want. And it turns out that one of the things that the agency did was they built houses they built Iron Nation a house, and they built Medicine Bull, another senior leader. They built a house for Medicine Bull. So obviously, in a way, that's like the Romans. What the Romans did in Britain was, yeah, they sent a few troops out there, but they co-opted the tribal chiefs, and they built them villas. If you ever go to England and you go to near Chichester, there's a Roman villa, but it was actually occupied by a Celtic chief. And it's beautiful. They found mosaics, and it's a wonderful place. Well, this was a kind of the same version, you reward the powerful people. Anyway, so eventually what happened is they moved the buildings. They went all over the place. I got some interesting information on the buildings. The agency house went up somewhere near its present location. The people of Lower Brule moved north across the barrier of the Gumbo Hills. And this didn't occur to me until actually the other day, is once the Bruleys were moved up to their present location, north of Fort Lookout, across from Fort Thompson, they were kind of isolated from the White River and Oacoma, this whole corridor. They were isolated from it. And in fact, in jurisdictional terms, when they divvy out the land for lawyers in South Dakota, one of the circuit courts, the jurisdiction is south of what is now I-90. They don't go north. So they really got kind of isolated across the Gumbo Hills. And of course, the settlers came in. They founded the town. At first there was Gladstone, Sherman, Oacoma, and it was platted in 1888. I got the plat for it. Anyway, and everyone moved on. Gosh, I'm almost ready. I'm getting close. Yeah. So they moved away, right? And the agency moved away. So you sort of think this is going to be the conclusion now. See, but it's not, right? It sounds like a conclusion, but remember I said an old house, they're strange how I love old houses because there's a book. There's this guy wrote a book. It's a wonderful book. He was some famous cartoonist, and I instantly bought this book because what he did was he took a piece of ground and he did cartoons about it. And it was first a piece of ground. It had dinosaurs running around with it, and then something came up, and then something came up, and then there was a house. And then what was really neat is when it became a house from about the teens, the room has stayed the same, but the decorations changed. And at one point, there was a family and kids, and then there were old people, and then there was another family and kids, and you just, all from that same spot. It was just this wonderful idea, And so that's the way I think of this agency house. It's kind of like a museum of memories for all the people who lived in it, who went through it. Houses are like that. We're so busy, we want to tear everything down, redecorate them. Their wallpaper's always a horrible color, or the paint's terrible, Kitchen cupboard's got to go, you know what I mean? Everybody has to have what do you call it now? In the bathroom, what's that thing? A wet room. I was in Kenya. I'm not supposed to tell stories. Okay, I was in Kenya, and I have to tell you, I went into this hotel room, and I walked in, and I looked, and there was a toilet, and there was a shower head, and there was nothing else between them. And I thought, what is going on? I thought, what kind of place is this? Little did I know how advanced they were, because everybody wants that now, right? They want to have just shower on the floor, I guess that's what you call it, for $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000, But anyway, so houses become these museums of memory. And so we can imagine them as witnesses to generations of people. So I want to go back to that mystery about why is this house not more significant? Well, it's actually a remarkable house because it isn't just the agency house. You see, this is it just gets me. And the funny thing is, it was in the newspaper article, but it wasn't in the National Register. It's just so weird. Because they happen to mention that it was called the M.Q. Sharp House. You know that Sharp guy, the lakes. And in fact, the meeting halls in this hotel, right? Sharp 1, Sharp 2. Well, so I've started to look into this. And now, if you go do the next picture. Oh, I got to go back to that one. I forgot. I'm going too far. I want just to tell you, whenever you look at historic pictures, look at them critically. Because one thing I noticed here, here are arranged some signers of the, of the act and witnesses, and you'll notice some tribal men arranged there. One thing I noticed was we don't recognize any of them. Those pictures, we don't recognize any of them. That's number one. Number two, the man on the left squatting down holding a pipe, that's a woman's pipe because it doesn't have that extension past the bowl and the stem. So it's almost as if they set up those people because the leaders aren't there. The leaders didn't want to pose for that. There's no way. So that's interesting about that picture. Okay, now we can go. I like that dog. Okay, now can you zoom in on that, Kate? Is that possible? Yeah, there you go.
It's
I know.
not very
Okay.
clear,
Oh, I know. That's not bad. Now, what I want you to do is look. Now, this is from Barbara Speck's wonderful Oacoma history site, A Labor of Love. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The woman who's just about in the center, the man next to her, and the man next to him. What you're looking at are the couple are William Williamson and his wife Clara. And I think they probably purchased that agency house in 1905. He was a USD law graduate. He came out to Oacoma to start his career.
Go back to that, can you click number 1 for a minute, and then we'll go back to that one. But I want to click on number 1 again, because I want to show them to you. See, that's him there, next to the guy, the boater. See him right there on the left? That is William Williamson. He, I think, more than, okay, you know how it goes. Dolan Robinson came up with the idea. Peter Norbeck was the champion, and so it goes. And if you read a lot of the accounts, that's what you hear. Well, William Williamson railroaded that through Congress. He was a congressman, United States congressman, and he also got it through the House in the state. So he was of singular importance in the development of Mount Rushmore. And there's even a page on the Mount Rushmore site on him. But you start reading the accounts on the web, just browse accounts on Mount Rushmore, you don't hear about him. Funny, isn't it? You don't hear about a person who was really, really important in the genesis of Mount Rushmore. So that was my connection, showing Mount Rushmore first. And if we go back to, we're at the settler picture. So, and wouldn't you know it, it's so amazing to me. And I'm not going to go into their careers, but I'll tell you one more thing about William Williamson. He wrote an autobiography. Now, nowadays everybody writes about their lives. That's so boring. But, in the days of publishers, you couldn't just write your book. Oh, I'm going to write a book, right? It was hard to get a book published. And if you had to pay for it yourself, right, clearly, that's the kiss of death. You never pay to publish your own book. That means nobody who was a professional read it, liked it, and you were forced to publish it yourself. So William Williamson wrote his autobiography at the end of his career, and sadly to say, it was privately published.
in 1964 in Rapid City. Well, amazingly enough, I don't know if you know Abe Books. I shouldn't plug a website, but used book website, but I found a copy of William Williamson's autobiography and Smelling of Mildew, and it's actually inscribed. I got his autograph too. And he should be better known than he is, because he was a circuit court judge. He did all sorts of things. And again, it's a really interesting chapter on Mount Rushmore. I mean, he was really important. He was a good friend of Peter Norbeck. And so that in itself was really, really interesting about him. Anyway, the other chap in that picture, who's on the right, shorter chap, that's Mr. Sharp. So he bought the house from William Williamson. Okay, and as we know, he became a governor, and they named that reservoir after him because he was one of the great proponents for the dams. Okay, so now we're coming to the real conclusion here. All right. Okay, so why was the agency house not on the same scale of importance as other famous houses in South Dakota? We have the thing that created basically the state of South Dakota happened there at Oacoma in that little house. A guy instrumental in building Mount Rushmore lived in that house. A guy instrumental in the dams lived in that house. It was allowed to become derelict, and it burnt down. So how can we possibly account for this? Well, I think I've got it. It took me a while, but I think I figured it out. First of all, for Oacoma, to be fair to the community, the agency moved eventually in 1895. And it wasn't until the agency moved that Oacoma was able to come into being. So once the agency, left and they moved the buildings, Oacoma was created. So there's no ties, in a sense, between Oacoma and the agency. The agency was actually in the way of the development of Oacoma. So they kind of inherited the house in the way that Lower Brule people, by having their reservation where it is, inherited Arikara and Mandan Earth Lodge villages. The tribe are the stewards of the villages of other people, ancient people. And then for Sharp, and for both of them, so Williamson and Sharp, each one of them had their own monuments, right? You're not going to think of Sharp, oh, I'm going to go to Oacoma and see, of course he was another lawyer, graduate of University of South Dakota Law School. So, you're not going to go to see, you'll go to see the birthplace of an author, or some famous person, you'll go, right? But for a professional, unless it's a grand house, something big, a spectacle, you're not going to go. It's the spectacle that sort of counts. And I think that Mount Rushmore overwhelmed the character, the people who contributed to it. It became much greater, even though he was the only person who was on the committee for his whole career, up to the 40s when it was finished, was William Williamson. He was overwhelmed, I think, just by Mount Rushmore, the significance of it. And M.Q. Sharp, the dams, that whole thing. People are going to think of those things. They're not going to go back when they were two young lawyers just learning their practice in, that's fabulous, but people aren't just going to stop there. And finally, though, if we go back to the newspaper, and this is the end now. How am I doing? Oh, I've gone over.
Okay.
Is that all right? Can I have 5 more minutes just to the end? Okay. The last thing, the thing that it says is the newspaper article. It says that Mike Jandrew, the chairman of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe, the tribe was thinking of buying the house. Now, think about it. Why on earth would they want to buy the house? Why would they buy a house that represented everything bad in terms of Lakota tradition? It just doesn't make sense. Yeah, but you know, it does make sense, and here's why. It makes sense because the agency house, now it's important to do this next picture quick. Okay, see this picture? Now look at that one. Go back and go forward. It's the same place. Those are Lakota kids. Those are Lower Brule kids. Sheldon Fletcher, who is a wonderful historian. He's one of those people who it's in the DNA, a kid who is interested in history. Sheldon brought these kids who were in a science class down to Oacoma to visit that house. And they're posed in the same place that those guys were in 1888. Now, the agency house was there when the Lakota culture and traditions down there were still vibrant, despite all of the depredations. And the descendants of all those people still live up in Lower Brule. And they continue to honor their ancestors and their deepest cultural traditions they maintain. They just do it in different ways. And until you live there a long time, you don't necessarily recognize it, but they're still there. They're still the same people. And so their direct connection to the land at Oacoma is unbroken. And so that house, even though you think they don't want to see it, they valued it because their people dealt with the agency. The agency was important to keep them going in the worst times in their lives, so it was important. And if you think about it, every house that survives into old age, just like people, has the memories of generations of them who lived there, and of course what happened in them. The actual history of South Dakota, if you think about it, is in all the little towns, the old city centers, every rundown homestead, farmstead, every one-room schoolhouse that you see sort of rotting by the highway, and the letters and the documents that ordinary people write that preserve something about their lives in the places that we inhabit. So really the significance of this agency house, and many others like it, large and small, these are the real museums of memory, not the institutions that are built that present the big ideas and then show you the artifacts. No, the real museums are those places, those old houses, where history actually happened. And, you know, all of us are here today in this room because of them. It's not because of the big ideas, it's because of all those little things. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say, and I'm done.